Star Trek saved one of its darkest sequels for the original series' Kids Only Planet. When people think about Star Trek, the original series, they often recall bright optimism, colorful costumes, and iconic moments like Kirk wrestling the Gorn or Spock's stoic logic. But hidden among the lighter episodes are stories that flirt with disturbing concepts. One of the strangest and darkest is Miri, the Season 1 adventure where the Enterprise discovers a planet populated only by children. On the surface, it plays like a Lord of the Flies in space experiment, but under the glossy 1960s sci-fi veneer lies a bleak tale about mortality, desperation, and humanity's tendency to play God. What makes Miri even more fascinating is that it was almost the beginning of something bigger. Decades later, writers and novelists toyed with the idea of returning to this world, exploring what happened to those kids after Kirk and crew left. That unwritten sequel, in many ways, could have been one of the darkest continuations in Star Trek history. The creepiest premise TOS ever attempted. In Miri, the Enterprise arrives at a planet that looks suspiciously like Earth, a budget-saving trick explained away as a parallel development. There, they find a society devastated by a failed attempt to prolong life. Scientists had created a treatment that gave children incredibly long lifespans, but with a horrific catch. Once puberty hit, the body was consumed by a grotesque disease. Adults went mad, their faces decaying, and eventually died screaming. That meant the only people left alive were children, onlies, as they called themselves, who were hundreds of years old but emotionally frozen in a permanent state of immaturity. They feared adults, calling them grups, and lived in a mix of innocence and paranoia. The episode ends with Kirk convincing them to accept Federation help, but the camera lingers uncomfortably on what's left unsaid. How do you rebuild a society with traumatized children who've watched every adult they loved die? The sequel that almost was. Gene Roddenberry and later Star Trek storytellers floated the idea of revisiting the Onlies in a sequel. Imagine returning to the planet a generation later. The Federation has provided assistance, but the children are now forced to actually grow up. They're no longer immune to maturity, no longer trapped in their eerie eternal childhood. Instead, they'd have to confront grief, responsibility, and the scars of their haunted world. In fact, one proposed follow-up would have explored the unsettling possibility that some Onlies resented the Federation's cure. After all, these children had lived for centuries, never having to face mortality. To be suddenly told, "You'll age now, you'll die one day like everyone else," would have been a brutal psychological blow. A darker sequel might have followed a group of Onlies who rejected normalcy and fought to preserve their twisted immortality, even if it meant restarting the same cycle of death. Why the story would have been so dark? Unlike Klingon battles or Romulan intrigue, this storyline cuts deep into the most primal human fears: aging, loss, and the fragility of life. For many of the Onlies, growing up wasn't just a challenge, it was a curse. They had lived as children for centuries, free of the responsibilities and limits of adulthood. To suddenly face time's unstoppable march would be terrifying. This sequel would also have forced the Federation to face moral responsibility. They intervened on this planet and changed its trajectory forever. If some Onlies resisted assimilation, would Starfleet let them slip back into their dangerous pseudo-immortality? Or would they force a cure on them for the sake of galactic safety? That's not the kind of black and white dilemma the optimistic Star Trek usually liked to linger on, but it's exactly the kind of complexity modern Trek thrives in. Echoes in later Star Trek. Even though the Onlies never returned on screen, their shadow lingers in later Star Trek stories. Episodes like The Next Generation's Half a Life, where Timicin chooses ritual death, or Voyager's Innocence, where children are revealed to be members of a species that ages backward, echo Miri's fascination with life cycles, mortality, and cultural attitudes toward death. The Star Trek novels did revisit the planet, exploring how the Onlies adjusted to Federation influence. In some versions, the Onlies grew into functioning adults but carried lifelong trauma. Others suggested faction split, with some longing for their immortal childhood and others embracing the Federation's structure. Though not canon, these ideas highlight just how much potential the original episode left untapped. A story too bleak for the 1960s. In truth, the reason we never saw a sequel probably comes down to tone. Star Trek in the 1960s was already accused of being too dark at times. Episodes like City on the Edge of Forever shocked audiences.